Welcome back, PetaPixel viewers. It is Chris Nichols here. We've got a fun video for you today because we have got our hands on every single Fujifilm X100 from the original all the way to the 6. What we're going to do today is a rundown of all the cameras, talk about what's changed over the years and which ones are still a good, viable purchase for you to pick up used. Let's get to it. And how do we get our hands on all these X100s? Well, we borrowed the X100 to the X100V, all from KH.com, of course, because they're PetaPixel's official pre-owned camera gear partner. Everything was in perfect working order. The condition of all the cameras was labeled very accurately, so again, there was no surprises there, and we knew that KH's technicians were going to go through the cameras, make sure everything was in proper working order. It really gives you the peace of mind, takes out all the guesswork as opposed to buying privately, because I know that what I'm looking for, what's advertised, is what I'm going to get. And of course, all these used X100s are going right back to KH, so if you want to get your hands on one of the ones we played with today, you can buy them. That's the place to go, KH.com. But of course, we did have to get our hands on the most elusive camera on the market right now, the Fujifilm X100 6. So the camera store, they let us borrow their demo, even though it's priceless. No, they're not selling it. It's probably worth $10,000 on the market right now. I'm probably going to scratch it up. Let's go shoot. All right, so we've had these 6 cameras for quite a while. I mean, the 6 we've had before in our previous testing for sure. And so, basically we want to do it like this. I would take the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th camera. Jordan would take the 2nd, the 4th, and the 6th camera. And then that way we can have differing opinions and, different perspectives on what we like in a camera and how they operate and cover all of this. But before we get into discussing each individual camera, I think we should just take a little bit of time to talk about the X100 series in general, because it all started here with this little beauty, the original X100. When this camera first came out, I remember there was nothing like it really on the market. There were some retro-inspired cameras, but really nothing like this that was beautiful and accessible. This had a relatively large APS-C size sensor. It had a fixed 35mm full-frame equivalent field of view, optical viewfinder, but with a digital overlay. That was really quite revolutionary, and it worked very well, and it really grabbed a lot of people's imaginations. And this camera here, even though they were APS-C, you gotta remember at the time when they first came out, the vast majority of competitive DSLRs were also using similar megapixel count APS-C size sensors. We kind of take it for granted nowadays we have a full selection of many different sizes of sensors and affordable full frame, but back in the day, full frame was very pricey indeed. But the X100 series did have some quirks, which we're going to talk about. They weren't perfect cameras, but regardless of your opinion on these, I don't think there's any denying that they're beautifully styled cameras with gorgeous retro-inspired controls that really gave you a fun tactile experience, and that styling has absolutely stood the test of time. Okay, so let's take a look at the not even close to brand new Fujifilm X100, the camera that kicked it all off. So this had at its heart a 12 megapixel APS-C sensor, and as I mentioned, this is actually very similar to contemporary SLRs, basically the same sensor you'd find in the Nikon D90. This also had a 1.44 million dot EVF, so if you didn't want to use the optical overlay, you did have a digital EVF, but it wasn't a very high resolution one. Back panel around 460,000 dots, but again, given the age of this camera, that was pretty appropriate back then. Now in the X100, the aperture ring only turned in full stop increments. The shutter speed dial did as well, but like modern Fujifilms, you could then use the jog wheel here to go third stop increments above or below the shutter speed that you've chosen. And you do have a nice little exposure compensation dial here, although I will say incredibly easy to turn when you don't want it to. I mean, that's a real problem on this camera. Now, another thing I want to mention here, this does go up to 4,000th of a second. It's a built-in leaf shutter inside the lens. However, when you're shooting wider apertures, you're limited. For example, at f2, it'll only go up to 1,000th of a second. So the X100 does have a 3-stop optical ND filter built into it, which would move in the path of the light. That was a really cool feature and very necessary when shooting on a bright day like this wide open. So what's it like to shoot the X100 original? Well, first off, I have to say I'm blessed that I get to use one with the latest firmware, because when the X100 first came out, it was buggy as That actually led me to really be turned off on this camera overall when I first played with it, and I know it upset a lot of first-time buyers. They did fix a lot with the firmware. I mean, the autofocus is a little bit more reliable now in single autofocus. Continuous is still basically unusable. One real frustration I have with the autofocusing on the X100 though is when you're actually waiting for the camera to focus, the screen doesn't keep giving you a live view. It just freezes up, locks up, and then suddenly reappears in motion again when the camera has focus. It's very jarring. So it's not great for kids or family kind of stuff. Other quirks here too, I've mentioned the exposure count button turns all the time. When you try to go into the menu, you undoubtedly end up turning the wheel or changing a function there. I can never just hit the menu button on its own. And this camera lacked a lot of customizability. Only one customizable function button here when I really have things like Fujifilm simulation modes, white balance, ISO that I want to change, as well as engaging the ND filter on and off. I wish I had more customizability on this camera. So should you buy one of these? I mean, as a curiosity, if you want to have the first in the series, sure. And if you are just taking nice shots on the street without a lot of fast movement, it does an okay job. But I honestly think that the X100 has evolved so much with the latest iterations that it's worth getting something more modern than this.
All right, it's Jordan to talk about the second one in the line, the X100S. And this was a massive upgrade over a barely functional original camera. First of all, when this shipped, it was actually usable, but there were a lot of major hardware upgrades as well. Here we moved over to phase detect autofocus, which theoretically should help a lot. But the big thing is we now have a 16 megapixel X-trans sensor, Fuji's kind of signature sensor pattern. But that was a real issue when this came out. If you were using Adobe software, it led to some very weird results, which fortunately did get ironed out over time. The other huge upgrade, we went from that terrible 1.44 million dot EVF to a 2.36 million dot EVF. So shooting with an X100S in 2024, I found to just be an absolute exercise in frustration. First of all, that back LCD on this, I couldn't make it out even shooting outside on a cloudy day. I found it very frustrating, so I just lived on the viewfinder here. And I did find the delay anytime I took a picture to be very, very distracting with this. Sure, they put phase detect autofocus on this thing, but I find constantly I'd have my subject separated clearly from the background. The camera would be like red dot, nope, can't focus on it. Or more frustratingly, it would give me a green dot saying your picture's in focus. I'd look at it afterwards, it's completely out of focus. Now in terms of picture quality, I remember thinking that 16 megapixel X-trans was fantastic in low light, and maybe it was for the time, but now shooting even 1600 indoors, it is just ugly noise covering the entire image. I really didn't like the look of the files that I got off of this. And you're like, Jordan, you're the video guy. Did you shoot video? Well, no, the video quality on this is absolute trash, so I didn't even bother. So nowadays, should you buy an X100S? Well, I mean, if you're the kind of photographer who likes to do battle with the limitations of your camera to get a usable result, then this might be a fun camera. I really see it as more of a collector's item, but I did not enjoy the shooting experience using this in modern days.
All right, and here's the Fujifilm X100T. T stands for third, and this brought some really thoughtful changes over the X100S. One thing that a lot of people are asking for is now an aperture ring with third stop increments. Just give you the nice fine-tuned control. Got a bigger 3-inch back panel here, just over 1 million dots. We do also add classic chrome to the Fujifilm simulation modes, and this now brought the convenience of USB charging, something we take for granted today. But there were also two major changes. Now, the first one was adding an electronic shutter mode up to 32,000th of a second. Now, this mitigated the need for using ND filters on bright days. However, this is still an older sensor, and so there was a lot of rolling shutter issues. I still found myself using mechanical most of the time. But the other huge change was now that the optical viewfinder had a digital picture-in-picture pop-up panel. This gave you a digital representation of a very small portion of the center of the screen, but it was great to judge things like exposure or white balance while still using the optical viewfinder. That being said, I found it's sometimes a little bit distracting, drew your eye away, and why not just use the full EVF when I wanted to have that display? It was just a quick flick of the switch. Okay, so what was the X100T like to shoot? Well, I do like the fact that they got rid of that wheel on the back around the joypad. It was so annoying, that's gone. And they've given us now a proper command dial, not just that flicky switch back and forth. It even has a customizable button press for that as well. I like that. Couple that with the function button, the fact that I can also customize the Wi-Fi button, this now gave me the customization that I wanted to have on an X100 camera. So I really did like the way that this handled in the field, but from a technological standpoint, I still don't know if I would necessarily recommend one, and that's because we're still not really getting any substantial autofocusing improvements over the older X100 cameras. That's still a big weakness here, especially for continuous, and we're still getting the same sensor and whatnot. So back in the day, yes, this was a thoughtful upgrade if you didn't buy an X100 or X100S, but I think there's still better deals to be had now.
Jordan again to talk about the X100F for fourth, and this was a huge upgrade. We moved from 16 megapixel up to 24 megapixels, still with an X-Trans sensor. We saw a big improvement as well on autofocus, moving up to 325 selectable points, and to help you select them, they put an autofocus joystick on this thing, which makes it a lot easier to work with. This also added a face detect autofocus, but I gotta admit, it is a little bit dodgy. I didn't find it terribly consistent. What I do like is the handling on this. This was a massive improvement where we could now lift the shutter speed dial to adjust our ISO, but we also got 2 clickable control dials. So this really opened up the ability to customize how you expose with this camera. As well, they moved up to the 126S battery that we're still using today, which gave us a nice bump in battery life as well. So what's it like to shoot with this camera nowadays? Well, when I took it on my family vacation to Vancouver, I actually had a great time with this. Sure, I couldn't treat it like a modern mirrorless camera. I wasn't using tracking. The face detect I found a little dodgy. But if I was using focus recompose with single shot autofocus, I was very impressed with my hit rate, and it was extremely responsive. I had a great time working with it that way. The big thing that stands out to me about this model is it really showed that we'd hit the threshold for this lens. Zooming in on my 24 megapixel images, consistently I find they're just a little bit soft, not a ton of detail in there. So I think the time had finally come to retire this outdated optic. So should you buy one of these guys today? I gotta say, as long as you're okay with the focus recompose and slightly soft images, this camera was a blast to use. The handling is really nice on it. I do wish the EVF was a little bit better, but for the most part, I had like a really pleasant experience bringing this around on my vacation. And if you find a good price, I'd grab one.
All right, so we got the brand new Fujifilm X100 V5. I mean, they couldn't use F again. They'd already used that for the X100F. So we're going Roman numeral 5 here. And this really represented probably the biggest upgrades that we've seen so far in the X100 series. So first off, we got a brand new 26 megapixel sensor, fast reading sensor, actually really good for video, nice image quality as well. We got a sharper lens, especially when you're shooting close up in the corners, but overall in general, it was really a nice optical improvement. But the list doesn't end there. We actually got an upgraded EVF up to 3.69 million dots, so good that I basically never use the optical viewfinder in this camera ever again. We also have a 1.62 million dot back panel. It's now touchscreen capable, and it tilts, which is incredible considering that it's still very thin, very svelte on the body, really doesn't make it any bulkier. And the list still doesn't end there. This camera is actually weather sealed as long as you used a filter on the front with the adapter. This camera also shot 4K. We actually shot the deeper review of this camera on an X100V, and Jordan actually really liked it. And most importantly, the autofocus now worked really effectively. Face detect worked, eye detect worked. This camera is really a joy to use, and this was the first camera in this series that really made me enjoy the experience. Everything that Fujifilm had learned with the versions before, this really brought it all together in a beautiful package. And I think that's why the X100V is so wildly successful and still so much in demand. Okay, so should you buy one? I mean, absolutely. This sensor was actually the best hybrid combination of good photo taking and video capability. It's a refined experience, but it's still incredibly difficult to get one. So good luck, but yes, you absolutely should get one, or you should get the new version, which Jordan's gonna talk about next.
All right, that brings us to the latest and final X100, the X100 Now this is the longest gap that we saw between camera releases, but the result is a substantial upgrade. Here we moved up to the 40 megapixel sensor, our favorite APS-C sensor for photography, but on top of that, we got the new processor. So that gave us the new autofocus, including subject detection, not like you're gonna be out shooting animals with this thing, but it does track people and faces much more effectively. The other big upgrade is we got IBIS in this, something we've been waiting for a very long time, and while the body is very slightly bigger, I think the trade-off is absolutely worth it. And I have to say, my shooting experience with the X100 was incredibly satisfying. Using it as just like a family camera, shooting my daughter's birthday, I just felt like it was very inconspicuous. I could grab it anytime I wanted, and the autofocus was very responsive, and the hit rate on actually focusing on the eye was a huge jump over what I've seen with the rest of this series. And the X100 opens up some really cool creative possibilities. The combination of having the ND filter and the IBIS means I can play with really slow shutter speed photography. I know Jaron had a lot of fun doing that. And this is also a fantastic video camera. So should you buy this thing? Well, I think if you're interested in this kind of camera, absolutely, it's expensive, but the real kicker is, are you actually gonna get one? Because this thing looks like it'll be back ordered until God knows when.
All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed our little walkthrough here on the Fujifilm X100 series. And I know it sounds like Jordan and I are really pushing the latest models. I mean, that could be said true for pretty much any camera series, but absolutely, there's still very good value, even in the older series of the X100, and hopefully this video and what we're talking about as far as upgrades helps you decide if those upgrades are actually important for the kind of photography that you like to do. Anyways, I hope you guys found this educational. Leave your comments below. Let us know what you think is your favorite X100 series of camera, or anything else you'd love to ask us, and then we'll answer it on our podcast, because you can watch that podcast on the exact same channel you're watching right now, or check it out on all your favorite podcasting apps. Just search for PetaPixel Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.